Brenda seized the opportunity. "Exactly, sir. We need to keep the boarding process moving. I'm going to have to call my supervisor if you can't resolve this." The threat hung in the air. Elias drew a slow breath. He wasn't a man to make a scene. Decades of training, of ingrained discipline, urged him to de-escalate, to find a quiet solution. But there was also a core of unyielding steel within him, forged in crucibles the young man in the suit couldn't even imagine. "Call your supervisor, then," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried an undeniable weight. "The ticket is valid." Brenda, flustered by his refusal to be dismissed, snatched up her internal phone. "Mark, I need you at gate B12. We have a passenger disputing a first-class ticket's validity." "Yes, an elderly gentleman. Seems confused." Her description dripped with condescension. Elias closed his eyes for a brief second. Confused. He who had once memorized maps of entire enemy territories in the dark, who could recall the names and faces of every man who'd served under his direct command, was now confused. The irony was a bitter pill. He could feel the stares of the other passengers, a mixture of pity, annoyance, and uncomfortable curiosity. A woman whispered to her companion, "Honestly, some people. If he can't afford it, why make a fuss?" Another, an older woman with kind eyes, looked at Elias with a flicker of sympathy, but said nothing. He was isolated, a solitary figure against a wall of institutional certainty and public indifference. His worn clothes, his quiet demeanor, his age, all were being used as evidence against him. He clutched the smooth stone in his pocket a little tighter. It had been given to him by a young private, a farm boy from Iowa with bright eyes and a nervous laugh, moments before they'd walked into a storm of fire. The boy hadn't made it back. Elias had. He often wondered why. Mark, the supervisor, arrived with the puffed-up authority of a man whose power, though limited, was wielded with maximum visible effort. He was younger than Brenda, with a sharp haircut and an even sharper suit that seemed a size too small, as if his ambition were physically bursting out of it. He listened to Brenda's whispered, animated account, his eyes flicking dismissively toward Elias, taking in the faded flannel, the worn shoes, the quiet stance. His expression hardened into one of practiced skepticism. "All right, sir." Mark began, his voice louder than necessary, designed to project control. "Let's clear this up. Brenda tells me you're insisting this first-class ticket is yours, but there seems to be some discrepancy." He drawled the word discrepancy as if it were a euphemism for delusion. Elias met his gaze evenly. "There is no discrepancy, son. The ticket was purchased for me by a friend, General Alistair Finch." He repeated the name, hoping it might somehow penetrate the layers of bureaucratic armor. Mark let out a short, derisive laugh. "General Finch, you say? Impressive. And I suppose he's waiting for you with a bottle of champagne in the first-class lounge." His tone was openly mocking now, playing to the gallery of impatient passengers. A few snickers rippled through the line. Elias felt a flush creep up his neck, not of shame, but of a deeply suppressed anger. He had endured mockery before, from enemies who held his life in their hands. This was different. This was an insult to his honor, and, by extension, to Alistair's. The general is a man of his word. Elias said, his voice tight. And he expects those he deals with to be the same. "Look, old-timer," Mark said, dropping any pretense of professionalism, his face hardening. "We deal with all sorts here. People trying to scam upgrades, people who are just plain confused. I'm trying to be patient, but you're holding up this flight. Either you have a valid economy ticket you'd like to use, or you need to step away from the gate." He gestured vaguely toward the general seating area. A clear dismissal. The tension was palpable. Elias stood his ground, a frail bulwark against a tide of disbelief. He thought of the promises he had kept, the burdens he had shouldered. This small indignity in the grand scheme of his life was nothing. Yet it was everything. It was about respect. Not for a first-class seat, but for a man's word. For a life of service that was now being casually invalidated by a jumped-up clerk. He could see the impatience in the eyes of the other passengers. A young mother juggling a crying baby in a stroller looked particularly harried. A businessman tapped his expensive watch pointedly. Elias was aware of the inconvenience he was causing, and it pained him. He was not a man who sought confrontation. His entire life had been about resolving conflicts, often in the most final of ways, so that others might live in peace. He glanced at the departure board. The flight was listed as boarding. Time was running out. His quiet endurance was being tested to its limit. He remembered a training exercise from decades ago, a brutal test of physical and mental stamina. They'd been pushed to the brink, deprived of sleep, food, and comfort, tasked with an impossible objective. His instructor, a man whose face was a leathery mask, had snarled, "It's not the mountain ahead that wears you out, Thorne. It's the pebble in your shoe." This right now was a very irritating pebble. He could almost hear Alistair's booming laugh, followed by a gruff, "Give him hell, Elias." Quietly, of course. Mark puffed out his chest, enjoying the small drama he was orchestrating, the brief moment of power over this confused old man. He folded his arms, a caricature of authority. "All right, sir, you're pushing it. We've been very patient. Now, for the last time, who is this General Alistair Finch you keep mentioning? Is he a household name? Should we know him? Because frankly, it sounds like you're making it up. Or maybe he's just some old fishing buddy who promised you the moon." His voice dripped with sarcasm, each word a carefully crafted insult designed to belittle and dismiss. Brenda smirked behind him, clearly relishing Elias's discomfort. The line of passengers murmured, a mixture of impatience and a dawning, uncomfortable realization that this was escalating beyond a simple ticketing error. Some shifted their weight, avoiding eye contact. Others watched with a kind of grim fascination. Elias Thorne stood very still. The noise of the airport seemed to recede. The faces around him blurred slightly. He felt a profound weariness. Not of the body, but of the spirit. He had hoped for a quiet journey. A moment of reflection before meeting old comrades, men who understood the silent language of shared experience, of sacrifices made in the shadows. Instead, he was here, under the harsh fluorescent lights, being treated like a vagrant or a fool. He looked at Mark. Truly, looked at him. At the arrogance in his eyes, the smug set of his jaw, the unearned confidence. And he knew that no amount of quiet reasoning would penetrate that wall. There was only one way. He hesitated for a beat, a flicker of reluctance in his gaze. He was a private man. His past was his own, a sacred, often painful territory he rarely invited others into. But Alistair's gesture, Alistair's friendship, deserved to be honored, not dragged through this mire of petty officiousness. He drew himself up, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to signal a subtle shift. The stoop in his shoulders seemed to lessen, and for a fleeting moment, the shadow of a different man, a younger, harder man, flickered in his pale blue eyes. "His name," Elias said, his voice low and steady, devoid of any emotion save a profound, unshakable certainty. Is General Alistair Finch, retired United States Army, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The full title, spoken with quiet precision, dropped into the charged atmosphere of the gate like a stone into a still pond. Mark blinked, momentarily nonplussed by the specificity, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs? All right, he scoffed loudly, turning to Brenda with a theatrical eye roll. And I suppose you were his personal bodyguard, eh? Saved his life 12 times? Is that the story? Brenda tittered, a high-pitched, unpleasant sound. Next, he'll be telling us he knows the president. She chimed in, eager to curry favor with her supervisor. The mocking laughter, though small, cut Elias deeper than any physical blow could have. It wasn't just him they were ridiculing now. It was Alistair. It was the uniform. It was the very notion of service and sacrifice. Unseen by the dismissive duo, a young woman standing near a vacant check-in counter a little further down, dressed in the simpler uniform of an airline intern, stopped fiddling with a tablet. Her name was Sarah Chen, a bright, observant political science student just trying to earn some credits and experience. The name, General Alistair Finch, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had snagged her attention. She'd written a paper on modern military leadership last semester. The name was not just familiar, it was prominent. Her brow furrowed. Something wasn't right. Sarah Chen tried to dismiss the prickle of unease. It wasn't her place. Mark was the supervisor. Brenda was a senior agent. She was just an intern, tasked mostly with fetching coffee and directing lost passengers. Yet the old man's quiet dignity, the unwavering way he'd uttered that full, formal title, didn't sound like the ramblings of a confused individual. And General Alistair Finch. She was almost certain she'd seen his name recently in an internal airline memo. Something about a new philanthropic partnership or a VIP advisory role. He was a major figure, a genuine titan. The idea that such a man would have a friend who looked like, well, like this unassuming elderly gentleman wasn't impossible. Heroes, she knew from her studies, rarely wore their heroism like a badge, at least not the real ones. Mark was now gesturing toward 2 airport security officers who had begun to stroll casually in their direction, clearly summoned. "Sir, you've left us no choice," Mark said, his voice taking on a tone of regret that was entirely false. "We need to escort you away from the gate area. You can discuss this further with airport security. Perhaps they can help you find your general." The threat was clear. Humiliation and possibly worse awaited Elias if he didn't yield. Elias simply nodded, a flicker of profound disappointment in his eyes. He wouldn't resist. He wouldn't cause a further scene. He had stated his truth. If it wasn't believed, then so be it. He looked tired suddenly, older than his 82 years. Sarah watched, her heart pounding. This felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Her fingers hovered over her tablet. There was an internal directory, a VIP alert system she'd been shown briefly during her orientation. Taking a deep breath, she quickly typed, "Finch, Alistair, General." Into the search bar of the airline's internal portal, her eyes widened. There it was, a prominent alert. General Alistair Finch, Rhett Dixons. Key airline benefactor and advisor. Extend all courtesies for any assistance required by General Finch or his designated guests. Contact President Harrison's office directly. Below it was a note. Personal guest, Mr. Elias Thorne, traveling today, Flight 212, first class. Please ensure seamless experience. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Seamless experience. This was the polar opposite. Mark and Brenda were not just making a mistake. They were potentially causing a catastrophic incident for the airline. She looked up. The security officers were now flanking Elias. Mark was saying something about causing a disturbance. Elias wasn't responding, just standing there, a figure of immense quiet sorrow. Sarah knew she had to act, and fast. Protocol dictated she should go through her immediate superior, but that was Mark. There was no time. Her hand trembling slightly, she navigated to the direct contact link for the airline president's executive assistant. She quickly typed a message. Urgent. Gate B12. Passenger Mr. Elias Thorne, guest of General Finch, being denied boarding first class, Flight 212, by Supervisory Mark Jenkins. Situation escalating. Security involved, per VIP alert, needs immediate intervention. She hit send, her breath catching in her throat. Had she overstepped? Would she be fired? Probably. But the image of the old man's dignified suffering and the sheer callous arrogance of Mark and Brenda propelled her forward. She could only hope someone read it. And quickly. Meanwhile, Elias had started to turn, ready to accompany the security officers. He didn't look back at Mark or Brenda. There was no anger on his face, just a profound weariness. The other passengers were now mostly silent. The earlier impatience replaced by a growing sense of unease and discomfort as they witnessed the quiet, forceful removal of the old man. Just as one of the security officers placed a light, almost hesitant hand on Elias's arm, a different kind of commotion erupted from the end of the concourse near the frosted glass doors of the airline's executive wing. Heads turned. A ripple of surprise went through the onlookers. A voice, sharp and resonant with innate authority, cut through the ambient noise of the terminal like a finely honed blade. Hold it. Hold everything, right there. Striding purposefully toward Gate B12, his expression a thundercloud of controlled fury, was a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly coiffed, his suit bespoke, his entire bearing radiating power and urgency. This was Arthur Harrison, president and CEO of Transglobal Airlines, a man whose face was more often seen in the financial pages or at high-profile charity galas than on the concourse floor. Flanking him was his executive assistant, a harried-looking woman clutching a tablet, her eyes wide with concern. Sarah Chen, watching from her discreet vantage point, felt a wave of immense relief, so potent it almost buckled her knees. Her message had gotten through. Harrison's gaze swept the scene, taking in Elias, the security officers, the belligerent stance of Mark, Brenda's nervous pallor, and the gawking passengers. His eyes, renowned for their shrewdness, narrowed dangerously as they fell upon Elias Thorne. There was a flicker, not of confusion, but of instant, profound recognition, mixed with something akin to disbelief and dawning horror. Mr. Thorne, Harrison's voice, though still firm, softened dramatically as he addressed Elias, a note of deep respect, almost reverence, creeping into his tone. Elias Thorne, is that truly you? Elias, surprised by the sudden intervention, turned slowly. He didn't recognize Harrison immediately, but the man's authoritative presence was unmistakable. Yes, sir. Elias replied simply, his voice retaining its quiet dignity. Harrison strode forward, pushing past the startled security officers as if they were mere statues. He stopped directly in front of Elias, his earlier fury now morphing into a look of genuine concern and something else. Elias, Harrison said, his voice now low and earnest. General Finch, personally, called me this morning. He told me you were flying with us. He considers you not just a friend, but a brother. He asked me to ensure your journey was exceptional. Harrison's eyes then flicked toward the first-class boarding pass still clutched in Elias's hand, then to Mark and Brenda, who had frozen in place, their faces rapidly draining of color. Mark's jaw, moments before set in a smug line, now hung slack with dawning terror. Brenda looked as if she might faint. The shift in power was instantaneous, absolute, and utterly devastating for them. "What in God's name?" Harrison bit out, his voice dropping to a lethal softness as he turned his gaze fully onto Mark. "Is going on here?" The air crackled with unspoken recriminations. The surrounding passengers, who had been a mixture of annoyed and curious, were now utterly silent, their expressions ranging from stunned to deeply ashamed. They were witnessing something far more significant than a ticketing dispute. They were witnessing the belated, dramatic arrival of consequence. Mark Jenkins, who moments before had been the self-appointed king of Gate B12, now looked like a schoolboy caught setting fire to the principal's office. He stammered, his carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Mr. Harrison, sir, there was a discrepancy with the ticket. The gentleman..." He gestured vaguely toward Elias, his hand trembling. "He didn't appear to be a first-class passenger, sir. We were just following procedure." Brenda, meanwhile, seemed to be trying to melt into the linoleum. Her face was ashen, her eyes darting nervously between Harrison and Elias, a silent plea for mercy in their depths. Harrison listened, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then his eyes, cold as glacial ice, bored into Mark. "Procedure," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is it procedure, Mr. Jenkins, to humiliate a guest of this airline? Is it procedure to dismiss and disrespect a man based on the simplicity of his attire, his age, his quiet demeanor?" He took a step closer to Mark, who involuntarily flinched. "Let me tell you about this, gentlemen." Harrison continued, his voice rising now, carrying across the suddenly silent gate area, reaching every passenger, every staff member. He turned slightly, gesturing respectfully toward Elias. "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. This man, Mr. Elias Thorne, is not just any passenger. He is not someone confused or trying to scam his way into a better seat." Harrison paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, many of whom now looked profoundly uncomfortable, their earlier judgments replaying in their minds. "This man," Harrison declared, his voice ringing with a mixture of pride and fury, "is a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. He served this country with valor and distinction beyond what most of us can even comprehend. He served alongside, and indeed, often led, men under the command of General Alistair Finch himself in theaters of war that demanded unimaginable courage." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several passengers visibly recoiled, their faces etched with shame and disbelief. The security officers, who had been awkwardly standing by, now subtly straightened their postures, a new awareness dawning in their eyes. Elias himself looked down, a faint flush on his weathered cheeks. He had never sought such public recognition. "This first-class ticket," Harrison continued, his voice thick with emotion, "was the absolute least that General Finch, and indeed this airline, could offer as a minuscule token of our immeasurable gratitude for his service, for his sacrifice, for the freedoms he fought to protect. Freedoms that allow people like you, Mr. Jenkins, and you, Ms. Wilson." He flicked a damning glance at Brenda. "To sit in judgment of your betters." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by a stifled sob from somewhere in the crowd. Mark Jenkins looked as though he'd been physically struck. Brenda was openly weeping, her carefully applied mascara tracing black rivulets down her pale cheeks. "You will apologize," Harrison commanded, his voice like steel. "Both of you to Mr. Thorne. Now." Mark, trembling, turned to Elias. "Mr. Thorne, sir, I am so profoundly sorry. I misjudged. I was wrong. Terribly wrong. Please forgive me." His voice was a hoarse whisper. Brenda, barely able to speak through her tears, managed to choke. "I'm so sorry, sir. So what's sorry?" Elias looked at them, not with triumph, but with that same deep, ancient sadness. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's forgotten," he murmured, though the tremor in his voice suggested it would not be, not entirely. Harrison then turned to Elias, his entire demeanor softening. "Mr. Thorne," he said gently, "allow me to personally escort you to your seat. And please accept my deepest, most sincere apologies on behalf of Trans-Global Airlines. This disgrace will be addressed. I give you my word." He offered his arm to Elias, a gesture of profound respect. And as Elias Thorne, the quiet hero, finally made his way toward the first-class cabin, leaning lightly on the arm of the airline's president, a spontaneous wave of applause broke out from the assembled passengers. A belated, heartfelt tribute to a man they had so grievously misjudged. The first-class cabin, usually a hushed sanctuary of privilege, seemed to hold its breath as Elias Thorne entered, escorted by Arthur Harrison. The flight attendants, already briefed by Harrison's assistant via a flurry of urgent messages, greeted him with a level of deference and warmth that bordered on reverence. "Mr. Thorne, welcome aboard." The lead flight attendant, a kind-faced woman named Susan, said, her voice gentle, "It is an absolute honor to have you with us today. Please allow me to show you to your seat." Elias, still a little overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, offered a shy smile. "Thank you, miss." Harrison personally ensured Elias was comfortably settled into a spacious window seat, a plush leather cocoon that was a world away from the hard plastic of the gate's chairs. He made sure Elias's small, worn bag was stowed carefully. "Can I get you anything, Elias?" Harrison asked, his tone that of a concerned friend rather than a corporate titan. "Some water? Coffee?" "Water would be fine. Thank you, Mr. Harrison." Elias replied, his voice regaining some of its quiet strength. As Susan hurried to fetch it, Harrison leaned in. "Elias, I cannot apologize enough for what happened out there. General Finch would have my hide, and rightly so. There was no excuse for that kind of behavior from my staff." Elias looked out the window for a moment at the bustling activity on the tarmac, then back at Harrison. "People make mistakes, son," he said softly. "It's what they learn from them that matters." Harrison nodded, humbled by the old soldier's magnanimity. "You are a far more gracious man than they deserve, Elias. But rest assured, lessons will be learned. Severe ones." He paused, then added, "Alistair speaks of you often, you know, with the deepest admiration. He often said that if he had 100 men like Elias Thorne, he could have conquered the world. With honor." A rare, genuine smile touched Elias's lips. "Al was always prone to exaggeration," he murmured, but there was a warmth in his eyes. Other first-class passengers, some of whom had witnessed parts of the commotion or had been quickly filled in by the flurry of hushed activity, now regarded Elias with a mixture of awe and a respect. A distinguished-looking older gentleman in the seat across the aisle leaned over. "Excuse me, sir," he said quietly. I couldn't help but overhear. Thank you for your service. He offered his hand. Elias shook it. We all did what we had to, he replied, his standard, humble deflection. Soon a steady stream of quiet acknowledgments came his way. A businesswoman discreetly asked a flight attendant to convey her respects. A young couple, clearly on their honeymoon, looked over with wide, admiring eyes. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. It was no longer just a collection of wealthy travelers. It was a space holding a man of immense, quiet significance, and everyone felt the weight of it. Susan returned with the water, served in a crystal glass, along with a small plate of gourmet cookies. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. If there is anything at all you need, anything, please don't hesitate to ask. It would be our privilege to serve you. Double asterisk. Elias felt a warmth spread through him that had little to do with the comfortable seat or the attentive service. It was the warmth of recognition, of respect, finally given where it was profoundly due. The earlier humiliation began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He was simply Elias Thorne, on his way to see old friends, and for now that was enough. The airline staff directly involved, Mark Jenkins and Brenda Wilson, faced the stark consequences of their arrogance and misjudgment, their careers irrevocably altered by their failure to see beyond the surface. But more importantly, a new directive, a new ethos began to ripple through the entire airline. Judge no one by their cover, for heroes and human dignity walk among us in the quietest, most unassuming of guises. This incident became a catalyst for change, a stark lesson etched into the corporate memory of transglobal airlines. His story, initially one of injustice, transformed into a potent reminder: true worth, the kind that endures, isn't measured by the cut of one's clothes or the volume of one's voice, but by the quiet dignity of a life lived with courage, integrity, and selfless service. We, as a society, must strive to cultivate the vision to see that worth, even when it's unadorned, and to remember the profound sacrifices made by those who defended the freedoms we too often take for granted. Their value is not diminished by time or hidden by humble appearances. It is a constant, waiting only for our eyes and hearts to recognize it. The world is full of hidden heroes, of quiet lives lived with extraordinary grace and fortitude. Let us endeavor to meet them, not with suspicion or dismissal, but with the open hand of respect and the grateful heart they so richly deserve. Subscribe to Hidden Sparks. If you believe that every act of service, every life of quiet dignity deserves to be seen, to be valued, and to be profoundly honored, let their stories inspire us to be better, to see deeper, and to always choose respect.